Welcome to this explainer. Look, today we are diving into what is arguably the most pivotal shift in all of human history. We're talking about how our mastery of heat energy acted as this massive compounding catalyst. Seriously, unlocking this immense power literally rewired everything: our technology, our labor, and honestly, our entire relationship with the planet. Let's get right into it.
So to really grasp this, we've got to look at the fundamental barrier humanity faced right up until the late 18th century. For thousands of years, we were totally boxed in by biological energy. Think about it. We relied entirely on muscle, wind, and water, and those sources, they're strictly limited by geography and the changing seasons. But then, starting over in Britain, that whole paradigm shifted. We finally shattered those constraints and figured out how to harness the massive, seemingly limitless power of inanimate energy on a huge scale.
Part 1. Breaking the energy barrier. The steam engine.
This whole revolution, it didn't actually start with some grand sweeping vision. It started with a practical crisis. Coal mines were flooding, and they needed a way to pump that water out, fast. Early pioneers like Savory and Newcomen, they built these atmospheric pumps. But, well, they were horribly inefficient. They wasted just a massive amount of energy because they had to constantly heat up and then cool down the exact same cylinder over and over again. Then, in the 1760s, James Watt had an absolute stroke of genius. He introduced the separate condenser. Basically, by creating a distinct secondary chamber, that main cylinder could just stay hot while the steam condensed somewhere else. It's wild to think that this one structural tweak was a total game changer. It skyrocketed efficiency, and thanks to a commercial partnership with Matthew Boulton, it allowed steam power to be rolled out across all sorts of industries.
So what's the big takeaway here? It's the macro-level scientific leap, successfully converting thermal energy, heat, directly into mechanical work. By translating that heat into rotational motion using gears and shafts, the steam engine did something absolutely incredible. It completely liberated factories from riverbanks. You simply didn't need a water wheel anymore. And of course, this rotational power didn't stay locked up inside factories. It went on the move, revolutionizing global transport. With George Stephenson's locomotives and Robert Fulton's steamships, we were suddenly shrinking distances and stitching together global markets like never before.
Section 2. The logic of the loom and the factory system. To really get how the factory system took off, we have to look at the textile industry. Before this, we relied on a decentralized putting out system, basically working from home. But there was a massive, glaring bottleneck. One single hand weaver required multiple hand spinners just to keep them supplied with yarn. What happened next was a rapid-fire chain reaction of breakthroughs that completely shattered that bottleneck. We start with Kay's flying shuttle in 1733, and then by 1764, James Hargreaves, spinning jenny, lets one worker spin multiple spools all at once. Then Richard Arkwright drops the water frame in 1769, followed by Samuel Crompton's spinning mule in 1779. Stacked together, these inventions meant we could suddenly produce incredibly strong, fine yarn at a massive, completely unprecedented industrial scale.
Now, why does this matter so much for how we live our lives today? Well, these new machines were absolutely massive. You couldn't exactly fit a spinning mule in your cozy rural cottage. They required centralized power, and that meant the workers had to come to the machines. This right here is the birth of the modern factory system. Artisanal craftsmanship was rapidly swept aside, replaced by specialized, highly repetitive tasks. And honestly, perhaps the most profound shift of all, for the very first time in human history, our time was no longer governed by the sun or the changing seasons. Nope. Human time was now strictly regulated by the mechanical clock and the rigid, unforgiving demands of the factory whistle.
Part 3. The Urban Crucible. Reorganizing Human Life.
This intense centralization fundamentally reorganized where and how humans lived. The focus violently shifted away from rural landscapes directly into rapidly growing industrial centers like Manchester and Birmingham. A massive catalyst forcing people out of the countryside was the enclosure movement. If you're not familiar, this was basically the consolidation of common, shared lands into private plots. Small farmers were literally displaced from land their families had worked for generations. With nowhere else to go and drawn by the factories clustering around steam power, they flooded into the cities. This mass migration effectively created the modern working class.
So this sudden urban shift creates two vastly different realities happening right side by side. On one hand, you have factory owners using Adam Smith's division of labor to achieve maximum economic output and just ruthless efficiency. This meant relying heavily on unskilled specialization, which, frankly, often meant employing women and children because you could pay them lower wages. But right alongside that booming economic output, was a truly devastating human cost. The immediate fallout of packing so many people into these cities was overcrowded tenement housing, practically non-existent sanitation, and just lethal outbreaks of diseases like cholera and typhoid. It was a grim reality, to say the least.
But, and this is absolutely crucial, the industrial city acted as a true crucible. All these intense urban and public health crises, they directly forced vital systemic changes. Out of this profound crisis and hardship came the very first public health reforms, most notably the Public Health Act of 1848. And on the labor side, these incredibly harsh conditions directly spurred the rise of trade unions. Workers realized they had to organize to fiercely advocate for their own rights and protections in the face of this powerful new economic machine.
So, we've looked at the groundbreaking machinery, the rise of the factory system, and the heavy, heavy human cost of all this urbanization. But taking a step back, we really have to ask ourselves, what actually fueled this? What was the underlying environmental and energetic source that made this massive, world-altering transformation even possible?
Section 4, Stored Sunlight, Fossil Fuels and the Fallout.
Okay, the short answer? Coal. This entire era was driven by the massive exploitation of coal. You see, renewables of the time, like wood and wind, they simply couldn't scale to meet the demand. Coal, on the other hand, offered this completely mind-blowing energy density. The sources use this beautiful metaphor. They call it fossilized sunlight stored for millions of years. It's so poetic, right? But scientifically, it's what provided the incredibly concentrated heat necessary for the era's major innovations, like Abraham Darby's pioneering use of coke smelting. That absolutely relied on coal to produce the high-quality iron that was needed to build all those new rails and heavy centralized machinery.
Now, we can't ignore the fallout. This energy revolution came with a massive and initially quite hidden environmental price tag. Burning all that coal released staggering amounts of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter straight into the atmosphere. It's what created those infamous, absolutely choking smogs you always hear about in cities like London and Manchester. We have to view this impartially. The immense progress brought by inanimate energy simultaneously established the very modern patterns of human-driven environmental impact, patterns that, well, we are obviously still grappling with today.
Ultimately, philosophically speaking, the fossil fuel age cemented a highly mechanistic worldview. Basically, nature was no longer viewed as this living, breathing system to be respected. It was now seen strictly as a repository of resources to be extracted and used. The first industrial revolution gave us the sheer material power to physically reshape the planet. We had successfully learned to be the masters of heat, and it permanently changed our trajectory. But as we wrap up, it leaves us with a pretty provocative thought about what comes next. Having entirely rewired the world with steam and coal, was humanity actually ready for the next massive leap? The mastery of the electron? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the systems that power our world.